Now we've got Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's running for President of the United States as an independent candidate. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Brian, thanks for having me.
Now, obviously, running as an independent, getting on the ballot is the whole ballgame here. So where do you stand right now with regard to ballot access?
I think we're on the ballot in 7 states. We have the signatures for another 8 states in the can, which means we have more than enough. Usually we try to get double what we're required to give us, because the DNC is going to come in the end and try to invalidate our signatures. So we want to make sure that we have a good cushion for that, for insurance. We're not handing those in for strategic reasons until the last minute to narrow the window that the DNC has to kind of tear the whole thing apart. So most of them, or many of them, you don't have to hand in until the end of July. And then the DNC will have about a week to go through them, whereas if we hand them in now, they'll have 4 months to go through them, or 5 months.
Well, let's talk about the presidential run more broadly. Nationally, you are, based on an aggregate of polling, according to Decision Desk HQ, you're at about 8.5% right now, down from 19% in September. In Texas, it looks like just below 10% right now, down from 12%. In Florida, you're at about 7.5%, down from 11%. Nevada, you're at 9%, down from 11%. And in Michigan, you're at about 8%, down from 26%. So what's the path to victory here?
Yeah, we don't believe those polling results. And there's actually a very good article in The Hill today that talks about how the polling companies, the polling establishments have changed their methodologies to ask questions in a way that makes it, that dampens our poll results. We're on, the DN, or this, one of the controversies that's happening right now, Brian, is that CNN is negotiating with the Trump and Biden staff, their campaigns, to try to exclude me from the debates. And they've come up with criteria that I need to be, among the 2 criteria that they're trying to use to exclude me is that I need to have 4 polls, prescribed pollsters that have me at over 15%. We handed in 5 polls yesterday that have me from their companies that they've chosen. And there's a 6th poll that came out today that I'm actually looking at. It's the Marquette poll that has me at 17%. We think those are accurate polls: the Quinnipiac poll, the Marquette poll, the Monmouth poll, the Harvard-Harris poll, the New York Times Siena poll, and all have me over that threshold. What you're seeing is a lot of the polling companies have changed their methodologies. So instead of looking at a 3-way or 5-way race, they ask this question first: in a 2-way race between Trump and Biden, who would you choose? And it offers you Trump, Biden, and other. Well, then, if you press other, you're directed to another field where you're given a choice of me or Cornel West or Jill Stein. And that's a deceptive way of asking the poll, because that's not the way it will appear on the ballot. And
let me ask you the question this way.
Yeah.
Let me ask you the question this way, because obviously if you are looking to actually win this presidential election, you need the support. You need to win one of at least the big states. You need to win California, Texas, Florida. Do you think that you have a path to victory to win one of these states? Because right now, I'm looking at the polling. You're at roughly around 10% in Texas. Trump is at 46, Biden's at 36. California, Biden's at 48, Trump's at 28, you're at 11. Florida, Trump's at 47, Biden's at 38, you're at 7.5. So even if the methodology isn't to your liking, there's a massive disparity here between you and the other 2 candidates.
Well, again, you're reading from a methodology that is not correct. If you look at my polling and you assume it's 17 or 18%, I'm 5.5 months out. All I have to do is get to 34% to win. So all I have to do is take a few points away from both the other candidates. Now, in head-to-head races, I beat both candidates. I beat Trump in a head-to-head race, and this is from the biggest poll ever done in this election, 26,000 people. The polls that you're talking about have usually 600 to 2,200 people. The Zogby poll has 26,000. It's 10 times what the other polls have. It has a margin of error of practically 0. And it shows that in a head-to-head race, I beat President Trump by 3 electoral votes. It's a nail-biter. in a head-to-head race against President Biden, I beat him. I win 39 states and he wins 11, so a landslide. So people want to vote for me. My favorability ratings are higher than either of them. I beat them among Americans under 35. I beat them in the battleground states among Americans under 45. And I'm not, the one cohort that I lose on is baby boomers, because up until now, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CBS, the networks, which is where baby boomers get their news, have not let me on to debate. But I think what we're going to see is I'm starting to get on those, and we have a high conversion rate. I have 5.5 months, which is light years. I'm doing better than any.
Well, let me ask you about that then. You had brought up the idea of a no spoiler pledge that you had put forward to President Biden to sign. In the spirit of this pledge, will you drop out in the fall if you're still polling below Joe Biden?
What I said is that I will drop out if President Biden agrees to drop out. If in a head-to-head race, he is losing to President Trump and I'm beating President Trump, he will have to drop out.
So what you're saying is if you're looking at this polling and the polling remains and you've got poll after poll after poll showing as we head into the fall, Joe Biden at a higher rate than you in these polls, that in the spirit of that pledge, would you be willing to if you're saying that you want him to sign this, would you also be willing then, just in the spirit of this pledge, to drop out if you are at that point?
I would.
Or you only do it if he does it, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm willing to drop out if he signs the pledge too, and then.
But if he doesn't sign the pledge and you don't see a path to victory, then.
I'm not going to drop out. Of course, I'm not going to drop out if he doesn't sign the pledge. I'm more likely. He cannot beat President Trump. I can beat President Trump. I'm not the spoiler. The spoiler is somebody who cannot win, and who is going to disrupt the expectation of somebody who can. And
with all due respect, there's not a single national poll from any pollster. I know that you take issue with their methodology, but there's not a single poll from a national pollster that exists that shows you even within striking distance. In most of these polls, even ones that are that aren't friendly toward President Biden, there's still a 5-time disparity between you and him.
Yeah, well, you're wrong about that. The Zogby poll shows me beating President Trump, and he, under no conditions, can President Biden beat President Trump. So, I'm not a spoiler.
Let me ask you a question because you brought up spoilers. The issue of playing spoiler has been front and center in this campaign. One of your top donors is Timothy Mellon, who was Trump's top donor in 2020. He's given $25 million to a super PAC supporting you, and he's given $25 million to a Trump-affiliated super PAC, which certainly does give the appearance that Trump's donors want you on the ballot to serve as a spoiler candidate on his behalf. So what's your relationship to Timothy Mellon, and why is he infusing your campaign with so much money?
I said this at the beginning of the campaign, Brian, that I want to run a campaign that appeals to both sides. I want to run a campaign that makes Republicans forget they're Republicans and Democrats forget they're Democrats. And everybody remember that they're Americans. So I'm getting money from Democrats, Republicans. I welcome money from people who support President Trump. I have people on our staff who came from the Trump campaign. I have people on our staff.
I understand all of that, but if he's giving money at the same time, $25 million is no small sum. If he's giving $25 million to Trump and to you, and this is a Trump-aligned donor, and he's your biggest donor to super PACs right now, do you have any relationship with this person? Do you know why he's giving you this massive amount of money? Because clearly this isn't throwing his support behind you if he's also supporting Trump at the same time.
You would have to ask Timothy Mellon that with a super PAC. I'm not allowed to coordinate at all with the super PAC, but
Do you have a relationship with him?
With Tim Mellon, I've met Tim Mellon twice.
Okay, and that was enough there's no other inclination as to why he's donating.
Like I said, I welcome money from everybody. I don't think that. Listen, I'm more.
You can understand how.
I'm not sure what you're getting at, but President Trump. I'm running against President Trump. I have been a huge critic of President Trump's. I think he was a terrible president. I think he gave us the lockdowns. I think he shifted $4 trillion into this new oligarchy of super rich billionaires. I think he ran up the debt higher than any president in history. He presided over a chronic disease epidemic. He promised to get us out of the wars, and he brought John Bolton, who's the center of the war machine, to run the NSA. He was a terrible president. I'm running against him, so I'm not sure what point you're trying to get at. But
I think the point is obvious just from a layman's perspective. If you have a Trump donor who's also propping up the super PAC affiliated with you, that it would suggest that that person wants you on the ballot because he would perceive it as deriving benefit for Donald Trump.
Well, that's what you say. I don't think that is obvious. I think maybe that.
Okay,
here's what I believe from.
Well, let me ask
here's what I believe from talking to Tim Mellon. I think Tim Mellon would prefer me to be president of the United States because he thinks that I would make a better president, and that if I'm not going to be president, that he would prefer President Trump to President Biden. Oh, I have a lot of donors who are in the same state, but would prefer, but Biden's their second choice.
I understand that. I understand
that. By the way, the national polls, every single poll that has measured my favorability rating has shown that my favorability rating is much higher than President Trump's or President Biden's. So most Americans would rather vote for me. The reason they're voting for President Trump or President Biden is out of fear, because they feel by voting for me, they're throwing their vote away. But they'd rather vote for me. And I think Tim Mellon is in that category. He thinks that I'd be a better president of the United States, but he's hedging his bet by also betting on Donald Trump.
On this issue of spoiler candidates, your own running mate has admitted that your odds are slim. A senior advisor to your race has said, "I don't think the Kennedy campaign and the Trump campaign are enemies. It's us against the Democrats." These comments come after your campaign's former New York staffer. I'm sorry?
Who was that?
I'm going to play that audio right now.
And it looks like in this instance with RFK, he's going to probably take a lot of the votes away from Biden, correct? I mean, that's what you're looking at.
Well, yeah, that's true. I don't think that the Kennedy campaign and the Trump campaign are enemies, but we're all about America, and we know that it's us against the Democrats. Either way it goes.
I know what the media has done is it's taken people who have nothing to do with anything to do with the senior management of our campaign.
Well, and is that inclusive of, there was the New York staffer who gave a presentation that the goal of the candidacy was to stop President Biden. But regardless, voters aside,
and that staffer was fired, and that staffer was not anywhere near senior
voters aside.
management.
Why is it so hard to convince those closest to you and those working for you that you're not a spoiler in this race? I mean, these are people who were on your campaign, regardless of whether they still are.
Well, those issues have nothing to do with spoiler. And the latter, you're putting out fires faster, or you're lighting fires faster than I can put them out. But they're fires that are brush fires. The only person that you've just quoted is somebody who was a contract block coordinator who was gathering signatures for us in New York. And the mainstream media, of course, which is trying to discredit our campaign, interviews somebody, a low-level contract staffer, and gets an opinion from them and then attributes it to that campaign. Do you think that's fair? And that staffer, by the way, was let go because of that. Oh, that's not journalism. That's just...
Well, I mean, I only work with the information that I have, and these are people who work.
Well, yeah, but you need to, part of being a journalist is actually verifying and checking information rather than just throwing stuff at the wall.
I mean, these are people who worked for the campaign. But let's move on. I want to talk about the issue of abortion.
We have 100,000 volunteers.
I understand. I do want to talk about abortion because
we don't screen them. We don't screen anybody for their opinions or their political affiliations. There's no organization.
I do want to talk about abortion.
That kind of political screening of people who volunteer for them.
So on the issue of abortion, which has presented itself as one of the top issues in the country right now, you stated a few months back that you would sign a national abortion ban. You then said that you opposed all restrictions. You now say that you support some restrictions. So help me understand your position. Would you sign a nationwide law restricting abortions after a certain point?
My position now is basically the same position as Roe v. Wade, which is that the woman, it's absolutely a woman's right to choose until late in the pregnancy, after the fetus becomes viable, that the state has a growing interest in protecting that life, and that my commitment is to reduce the number of abortions, not through force or through coercion, but through policies that will do that. About 52% of women interviewed who terminated pregnancy say that they do that for economic reasons because they can't afford the baby. And I don't believe that anybody should terminate a pregnancy for that reason. I think we need good child care policies in this country, the kind they have in every country in Europe and around the world, and that we need to bring a lot of that money home from Ukraine and invest in childcare to make sure to actually benefit our economy and to grow our economy and to make sure that women who want to bring a baby to term are not terminating that pregnancy.
So on that point, then,
financial insecurities.
In a recent podcast, I believe it was a week ago, with Matt and Shane, you said that you support these restrictions because you learned of women having, and this is a quote, a huge amount of abortions up until, what it would be at the late term, so days before birth. And this is a point that a lot of anti-choice Republicans make, but none of them have been able to substantiate it. So my question is, what's the proof here? Like, do you think that women who are in good health with healthy pregnancies are just walking into doctors' offices asking for abortions 2 days before birth?
Yeah, my assumption was that that was not true, and that's why I changed my position. My original position was that it should be a woman's choice right up until the 9th month. And my assumption was that that no woman is going to carry a baby for 9 months and then get an abortion unless there are extenuating circumstances.
And you don't believe that, but you don't believe that anymore.
You want me to finish?
Yes.
All right, unless there are extenuating circumstances, for example, that the baby had a disease that would ensure that the baby would only live a couple of hours or maybe a couple of weeks in agonizing pain, or if the mother's life was at risk. And in those cases, the last thing that you would want is a bureaucrat or state government to come in and mess with that decision. What I learned was that there are a tremendous number of elective abortions at the last stage. And I can't tell you why that happens, but all I can tell you is the data that we're looking at that was shown to me indicates that that is true. And therefore, I changed my position, which I always say to people, I'll never change position because people are angry at me or because people defame me. The one thing that will cause me to change my position is facts that show that my worldview does not account for, and my policies do not account for for reality.
Well, on that point, I mean, do you know what % of women are getting abortions after 21 weeks? And this isn't a gotcha.
I don't know the exact percentage.
So the exact percentage is 0.9% of these of women who are getting abortions after 21 weeks. So a minuscule number of a percentage of women. This 99.1% of women who are not. The most recent study from 2022.
And what percentage of those are elective abortions?
So the most recent study from 2022 of patients seeking these later term abortions found that they fell into two buckets. It was either fetal anomalies or health risks to the mother, or women who didn't know they were pregnant. And then the other bucket is women who experienced barriers to abortion services earlier in the pregnancy. So the question then becomes, when you say that there are a huge amount of abortions that would necessitate some federal intervention, where is the proof of that?
Well, I would have to look at the data again, and which I'm happy to do. But the data that we were shown was that there were a large number of abortions that were elective in the end, at the end of pregnancy. So if there are any abortions at that point, it's wrong. It's a viable child at 9 months, and let's say 9 months in 1 day. Should you be able to abort? I mean, do you think you should be able to abort a perfectly healthy child at 9 months?
But there's no evidence that women are doing that. That's the whole basis for what I'm asking. When you impose federal interventions against women who the data show are dealing with fetal anomalies, health risks to the mother, then I shouldn't be litigating that. No government bureaucrat should be litigating that. That's a decision between a woman and her doctor, because these issues are highly personal.
Yeah, and so here's what should make you happy, is that the only abortions that I would limit at that time would be elective abortions. I would not abort it. If there is a medical reason for the abortion, I don't think it should be. I think that should be between the mother and the doctor. The only abortions that I would limit at that time, or allow the states to limit, would be elective abortions. So if there's a lot, then those would be regulated by the state. If there are only one or two, then those are the ones that would be regulated.
I want to switch gears to, in a deposition that was obtained by the New York Times, you had claimed that you suffered cognitive damage because of mercury poisoning, and you've spoken about this pretty frequently, and a brainworm, a parasite that ate parts of your brain. You said that these cognitive problems decreased your earning power and they compromised your ability to pay spousal support. So if you yourself said that these cognitive problems were severe enough to be brought up as a legal basis for not paying spousal support, how do you respond to concerns that these problems would make you unfit to serve as president, which is obviously a physically and cognitively taxing job?
A couple of things I don't think you're accurate about. One is it's a 13-year-old deposition. Two is I knew that I was experiencing cognitive problems back then. I don't think it was because of that parasite. There's 1 billion people in the world that have that parasite, and many of them don't have any symptoms. I believe today that my cognitive issues were attributable to the mercury. I had 10 times the rate of mercury that EPA considers safe, and I had that mercury chelated out. And my cognitive problems disappeared. And I take cognitive tests every day, and it's, on TV shows like this, on podcasts. I think the ultimate cognitive test will be a presidential debate, and I would welcome that. And I would welcome, the other candidates to also participate in that cognitive exam with me.
Well, President Biden obviously released his medical records when Donald Trump was president. He released his as well. Would you release your medical records to give the American public a full look at any cognitive problems?
Yeah, sure, I will. I'm happy to give my medical records to the same extent that the other candidates did. But, what I think that you should really be concerned about, Brian, is whether the presidents are actually cognitively capable, if they have the mental acuity that presidential candidates to take on this job. Remember, this is a job that if there's a nuclear emergency and the president is woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning, he has 7 minutes to make the decision about whether to retaliate. At that time, he's pulled out of bed. He's being run through tunnels with 6 Secret Service people pushing him. Do you want President Biden? Do you trust him to make a decision that is going to affect the lives of every American and your children? That test should happen, not because of medical records where doctors can obscure problems with their powerful patients, rather by allowing every American to observe the mental acuity of these candidates on a stage in a public forum under hot questioning, annealed in the furnace of debate and conversation. And that, I think, is what, if you're genuinely concerned about this issue rather than just agenda driven, I think that's probably what we should be looking for.
I want to finish off with this, and then we'll end it here. So your views on vaccines have obviously been controversial. I'm not, going to delve into the anti-vax sentiment or whatnot, but I do want to talk about one instance in Samoa. In 2018, there were 2 children who died from a measles vaccine. That was after a nurse incorrectly mixed the vaccine with a muscle relaxant, so it was human error. The Prime Minister then banned MMR vaccines after that. Your organization, Children's Health Defense, praised him. You then visited in 2019 in a trip that was arranged by an anti-vax influencer named Edwin Tomasese. You met with another anti-vax influencer named Taylor Winterstein. So anti-vax sentiment spread across the island, and later that year, Samoa was hit with a measles outbreak that was the express result of a decline in vaccination rates. I believe only 31% of Samoans were vaccinated at that time. In the year leading up to 2019, there were 0 cases of measles in those years. In 2019 proper, though, there were over 5,000 cases and 83 deaths. So do you recognize how perpetuating vaccine skepticism or especially propping up anti-vax influencers can lead to such devastating health consequences?
No, the best evidence, first of all, I had nothing to do with the drop-off in vaccination rates in Samoa.
Well, the AP did an interview. Sure. Let me just say the AP did interview folks who were working on the Samoan measles response, and they said that the credibility that you gave to the anti-vax population, the anti-vax forces, did have an impact.
Well,
those were people who were in Samoa.
But there's plenty of data on the drop-off. The vaccine was banned before I went to the country, so the drop-off that you saw did not change between the time I left the country and the time of the measles epidemic. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the deaths that occurred, the best evidence shows that the deaths that occurred from measles that year were a result of a defective vaccination. The people who died were people who got the vaccine while they had measles, which you should never do. In Tonga, which is next door, which also had a measles outbreak and where they were not given the vaccine, there were no deaths. Oh, of course, the vaccine cartel and the public health cartel that likes to propagandize on this issue points to this and say, oh, the deaths occurred because lowered vaccination rate, but there is no data that shows that. There's no paper that shows that. There's no science that shows that. There's just propaganda, and the best science indicates that the actual reasons for those deaths in Samoa were a defective vaccine that was brought in from Australia and was pulled when the public health authorities realized that it was killing people.
But that's not what the evidence says. The evidence says that it was actually 2 vaccines that were mixed with an expired muscle relaxant.
You know what? Again, That is propaganda. That is propaganda. And there was a series of deaths that occurred from vaccines, from the MMR vaccine prior to that, and a series of injuries, including in the Prime Minister's own family. And that's why he made the decision long before I went to Samoa to ban the MMR vaccine in Samoa.
Donald Trump has come out and said that he wouldn't fund schools that mandated certain vaccines. Do you agree with that decision?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time. I understand that it's easy to stay in certain ecosystems when speaking to media figures, so I do appreciate you venturing out and kind of being willing to speak to me here.
I appreciate you having me on, Brian. I want to speak to everybody, including people who don't agree with me on issues. I want to say this. My vaccination policy will not take away vaccines from anybody who wants access to them. My only issue is they should not be mandated. I don't think any medical intervention should be mandated. And let me just say this. Right now, the CDC is recommending the 9th COVID booster. Oh, that's their recommendation. 90% of Americans have made a decision not to take it. Do you think that the federal government should do what they did with the first booster, which is to tell people, okay, you can't work, you can't travel, you can't get on an airplane, you can't go to your job unless you do what CDC says? So I don't think that most Americans want that. What I want is good testing, good safety testing for vaccines, good efficacy testing, so that everybody can make informed consent about whether they want this product or not, whether it's good for their age group, whether it's good for their cohort, whether it's good for them. And let's do the same kind of safety testing that we require for other drugs. And we don't do that for vaccines. Vaccines are exempt. The only medical product that's exempt from pre-licensing safety studies. And of the 72 vaccines now mandated for our children, not one of them has ever been tested in a pre-licensing safety study. That's just wrong. We know people get injured, and that's who I'm concerned with. If you're fine with it, if you've gotten a good result, you should be able to get it. We ought to be not telling people when they're injured that it didn't happen and gaslighting them and punishing doctors who report injuries. We should be doing good science, and we should be supporting people who actually get injured by these products.
I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but the numbers are pretty clear in terms of the efficacy and the safety of this COVID vaccine, and it was used on the biggest, on the largest scale of any vaccine in America in the history of the world. And again, those numbers are pretty clear in terms of the efficacy of this vaccine, in terms of the number of hospitalizations and deaths for people who didn't get the vaccine versus those who did get the vaccine.
Okay, Brian, you know what? You're talking about data that does not exist. And I'll just tell you a couple of things. Our country had the worst body count from COVID of any country in the world, and one of the most aggressive vaccination schedules. We had 60%.
I would also say that we had the Republican president who was not exactly advocating for vaccinations or even taking the virus itself seriously. I mean, Donald Trump was downplaying the severity of the virus.
Now you're talking crazy talk, but let me just finish this.
It became completely politicized, and there was a clear delineation.
President Trump brags about the vaccine as the miracle of his administration, the Operation Warp Speed, the greatest accomplishment of his administration. So he wasn't hustling the vaccine; he was doing whatever Anthony Fauci.
There was a clear partisan divide in terms of people who take the vaccine. But I'll let you go. Go ahead.
Let's just talk about data. We had 16% of the COVID deaths in our country. We only had 4.2% of the world's population. So why isn't somebody explaining to us why we had the highest death rate in the world? We were told that Haiti and Nigeria were going to get wiped out from COVID. Haiti had a 1.3% vaccination rate. It had a death rate from COVID, 1/200th of our death rate. Nigeria had a 1.4% vaccination rate. It had a death rate from COVID of 14 per million population. We had a death rate of 3,000 per million population. So there's no correlation between vaccination and death counts. In fact, the best studies, like the Cleveland Clinic study, which is 56,000 patients, one of the biggest studies, shows that people who got vaccinated were more likely to get COVID. There is no study that shows that COVID had a beneficial impact on deaths. I know that you're told that. This is orthodoxy, but the studies just simply don't exist. And the clinical trial study is never measured for that. In fact, Pfizer's clinical study, which is the one that is made public, showed that people in the placebo group were 23% less likely to die than people in the vaccine groups. The vaccine, if you got vaccinated, you're 23% more likely to die of all causes over the next 6 months, with a 500% increase in cardiac arrest. We're now seeing a whole generation of kids who are dying from cardiac arrest on the playing fields. We're seeing athletes drop dead on the playing fields at rates we've never seen in history, and nobody is explaining that. And the press, the liberal media, is not asking the questions, was that person vaccinated and does this? We're seeing 2 of the 4 vaccines have now been pulled because of pericarditis, myocarditis, thrombocytopenia, which is blood clots. We're seeing larger excess deaths last year after vaccination with no COVID than during the height of COVID. So nobody can explain this, but what you were saying about the decline in deaths simply because of the vaccination, that data simply do not exist.
Well, I would disagree with that, but I'm also not a doctor.
Show me the data.
I would say,
the data. Show me the study that you're looking at.
I do have to ask, is it your position then that the politicization of the virus, of the vaccine, had zero impact on survival rates in the aftermath of COVID? There was a clear delineation. There was a clear delineation between Fox News watchers, for example, who had higher death rates than those who were not watching Fox News, who were not consuming right-wing media, who had higher survival rates.
Well, I wouldn't say that the highest death rates in this country was in New York, which is a blue state.
Right, but that was in the beginning before there was a vaccine. At the end of the pandemic, it was actually in Florida, led by Ron DeSantis, who is, of course, a major opponent of any vaccines.
Well, Florida would have, you would expect Florida to have the highest death rate. I'm not sure that it did. I know that Florida outperformed California, and they're roughly equivalent in size, but Florida has a much older population, and those were people who would die from COVID. So I think what you're saying about red state or blue state, that there is no study that, there are lots of other, there's more obesity in red states, there's more elderly people in Florida, so there are a lot of covariables.
You don't think politics played any role in the acceptance or refusal of vaccines in the aftermath of COVID?
I do, but I don't think vaccines had a benefit. I don't think there's any data that show that the vaccines had a beneficial impact on the reduction of COVID or survivability of COVID. I'd love to see the study if you can show it to me.
I'll be happy to put it on the screen. I obviously can't grab it.
All the data that I am looking at, for example, take a look at the Cleveland Clinic study. Take a look at the studies that are coming out of Europe right now. One after the other, they're showing that there was no beneficial impact to the vaccines. There may have been. One of the problems during COVID is that we had information chaos. We didn't, Dr. Fauci and his cohorts were not giving us good information on basic things like infection fatality rates and the use of therapeutic drugs and comparisons between ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, famotidine, and all these other drugs that demonstrated efficacy against COVID and comparing those against vaccines. We never saw those kind of data, and that's what we should have seen. That's what good managers would have done.
So I have something here from the CDC. Vaccinated Americans are up to 14 times less likely to die from COVID. That was from the CDC.
Yeah, and show me. Right, and those studies that CDC cranks out are modeling studies. They're not data studies. They're not observational studies. They're not epidemiological studies. They're studies that show that start out with the premise, we think this is how many people are saved by the vaccine, and then they model that. But there's no actual real world data. And they use that to hoodwink you, Brian. That's how they hoodwink the American press. They use these phony studies done by biostitutes, which are these mercenary scientists who can, what they say in my...
We'll see. There is a ton of data out there that shows from people who owe their lives to the fact that they were able to get vaccines. You have people who weren't.
How can you do that study? Explain to me how you do that study. How do you do a study when somebody says, I got the vaccine, therefore I'm alive today? That's not science. There's plenty of people like me who didn't get it and are alive today. Should I say that I didn't get it because I'm alive today because I didn't get it?
I think you can look at the number of people who did die during COVID who weren't vaccinated, and that would tell the story pretty clearly.
Yeah, well, and guess what? The vaccinated cohorts were more likely to die than the unvaccinated cohorts, and you don't have good data because the vaccinated cohorts were so small.
I think it's a little bit it's a little too convenient to say that any data that doesn't support your conclusion is not good data.
No, but I agree with that. So let's look at, I'm happy to sit down with you on another show, go study by study, and I will show you the problems with those studies, and you can show me the problems with the studies, which are overwhelming on the other side. But what I would say to you is, because the public health agencies were not funding good studies during COVID, they were funding deceptive studies, that we don't have really good data where you can say definitively one way or another about each cohort. But, even CDC today is saying it's a mistake to give these vaccines to kids. The death rate to kids from COVID was zero. Zero. Why would you give them an intervention of something that does have a risk, that can kill you, if they have no risk from the disease itself? I think there were a lot of mistakes made.
We'll leave it there. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.